Okay, so hello and welcome to this HTML5 Immersion Day. Today we're going to be covering dynamic rich media. My name is Owen Corso.
I'm Kevin McFarland.
We're creative specialists here at the DoubleClick team, and we're so excited to show you all of this wonderful material about how you can create a dynamic campaign using DoubleClick's digital marketing platform. And what are some of the benefits of dynamic?
Dynamic creative allows you to serve different versions of a creative to different users. So different users see different messaging in the creative. It's a way to quickly learn to optimize from best performing content. So say one headline starts performing better than other headlines over time, that starts serving more. Also, you can update the contents, the dynamic elements, even after the campaign has been launched, without needing to retraffic the creative. And finally, at a high level, it really follows in the direction the industry is going, which is towards more granular targeting on the back end with things like programmatic. If you go to all that work on the back end to try and target your users, why serve them the same generic creative at the front end?
Yeah, when you start thinking about programmatic, you have a sales funnel. So you have these different audiences throughout the sales funnel. And dynamic allows you to use the same creative and target these different types of users.
Different places in the funnel.
So we have the right user getting the right message at the right time. And it's a very powerful kind of technology stack that brings these beautiful creatives to life.
It's the wave of the future.
Okay, so today we're going to start out with a demo where we show a completed ad. That has all the bells and whistles already created. It's got the profiles code in there. And then afterwards, I'm going to hand it over to Kevin. He's going to walk us through how to actually set up the profile, attach the feeds to it, and so on. So we're going to move quickly through this. We hope we have enough time at the end for Q&A. And great, let's get going here.
While Owen's queuing up the creative to show you, what you'll see in the creative may look pretty simple. The real power is under the hood when we start looking at it in Studio.
So
live tag.
So here we are in Google Web Designer. We have a expandable creative with two display states. Everything's blank because we initially start with 0 opacity. If I click the play button here, everything animates in, and you can see we have a logo, a headline text, an image, and if I just preview this in my favorite browser, Chrome, we see this beautiful creative. When I click on it, it comes in. We have a CTA here at the bottom. Right now it says click here. That's the default. That's the default content.
What you don't see is that under the hood of this creative, in GWD, we've got it wired up to read content for the headline, the CTA, and the click-through from the dynamic data being passed into it.
Yeah, that's down here at the bottom. You see the invocation code, but we'll get into that a little bit later. Great. So handing it over to Kevin.
So what I'm going to do is to walk through first at a very high level the different steps of the dynamic workflow, how you go about creating a dynamic creative on DoubleClick. And the three parts of it are basically a feed, a profile on Studio, which is a way of connecting the creative and the feed and the creative itself. And the best place to start when thinking about dynamic is, what are you trying to accomplish? Why are you making a creative dynamic? And the most common three reasons for making something dynamic, for using dynamic strategy, fall into these three types. Number one, testing. You have, say, different headlines or different content that you want to try serving to users. The dynamic ad server on the back end, over time, will start optimizing so that the best performing content serves to users. The second type of strategy, dynamic strategy, is targeting, where you want to serve different content to different users. For example, you want to serve one headline to a user in one country, another headline to a user in another country. You're not just limited to targeting by geographical region. You can also target by DCM, creative ID, or placement ID. You can target by date or time. You can target by audience list. Remarketing, which, as you know, is the user's gone to your advertiser's website, viewed some products. Later on, when they're served a creative, you want to show them some of the products that they previously viewed. To sum up, the difference between targeting and testing is testing or optimizing. You're serving all content to all users, and over time you're finding out which performs best. You start serving that more. Versus targeting, you're targeting specific content to specific users. And finally, the third bucket of dynamic strategy is combining both. For example, you might have multiple headlines for a user in Brazil, and the users in Brazil see those headlines. Users in Argentina might see another group of headlines. But within each of those headlines for Brazil, for example, over time, the dynamic ad server will start optimizing to start serving the best performing headlines more.
Just to be clear, this is for a DoubleClick ad. I just showed the Google Web Designer Creative, and that was for upload into DoubleClick Studio. And these dynamic units, and the one specifically that we showed, are meant to go on Internet Explorer and all popular modern browsers. So we've talked about dynamic content. What exactly do we mean? And the best way to think of it is as a spreadsheet. Dynamic content usually, most commonly, lives as a Google sheet. And talking about about how you design a feed, again, it has to do with the dynamic strategy you're trying to accomplish. For example, if you just have different headlines or different calls to actions, they can all live in a sheet, and the best way to think of it is that all of these rows are eligible to be served to a user, but over time, the dynamic ad server on the back end will learn that maybe, for example, this third CTA starts performing better, and it will start serving that more. Versus targeting, you have a feed and you have a column on which you're going to target. In this example, it's a very simple example. Most feeds can be anywhere from several rows to hundreds or even thousands of rows. I've made this feed very simple just for learning purposes. In this feed where we're targeting content, we have a column of geolocations so that users in California will be served this row, users in New York will be served that row, and users anywhere else will see the default row. There's other subtleties having to do with feed design. We'll get into that a little bit later. Now, how do you marry the feed to the creative? You do that in Studio. In Studio, you have an area, a tab, Dynamic Content, and within Dynamic Content, you'll see your advertiser. You do need to enable your advertiser for Dynamic. It's a one-time thing. After it's been enabled for Dynamic, you come into this dynamic workflow where there are basically 7 steps. And I'm going to first show you the 7 steps at a high level, and then we'll talk. I'm going to actually go in and build a profile. It starts by creating a profile. That's step 1. You see these numbers up at the top of the screen. Those correspond to the steps in Studio. Number 2, you import your dynamic data. The feed we were just looking at, for example. You would come here and click the big red button that says New Content, and that brings you into sort of a sub-workflow
We're still in step 2, manage data, but we're in the sub-workflow where number 1, you tell it where the feed source lives, and number 2, you then do a few things like tell the dynamic backend how to interpret some columns in the feed, and you also set data types.
So every profile field corresponds to a data type. Some of the examples there are texts, URLs, geo, date time. There's also the ability to copy in an asset library ID. This is how you tell the profile how to treat that field in the profile.
Exactly. After you've done that, you repeat those steps if you have any additional sheets or feeds. Again, it all depends on your dynamic strategy. Some campaigns are run with just one feed, one sheet. Others might be multiple sheets. After that, you're in step 3, manage rules. This is where you basically apply your dynamic strategy. You say, I want this particular feed to be served in an optimized manner. I'm testing different headlines or different CTAs. Or you want another feed maybe to be targeted by geolocation. You're then brought into step 4, where basically the dynamic backend gives you, in JavaScript form, a schema of the dynamic data. You copy and paste this dynamic setup code into your HTML5 creative.
And that's the default code. Like when you're testing locally, and you want to see something. It doesn't have the actual dynamic data from the server that's given to the ad. It's just placeholder text that allows you to develop locally, test in Studio, and then when you view it in dynamic preview within the steps 5 of the profile, then that's where you can see and test the different rows in the feed, test different scenarios that trigger the rules, and that's the link between the profile and creative development. Is that invocation code? It needs to be pasted into the unit.
So backing up a bit, you're in dynamic workflow in Studio. You've gone through these 4 steps. It spits out the code for you. You now copy and paste the code into your creative, for example, in Google Web Designer, and then you do a few. It's really a 2-step process. Number 1, paste that setup code into your creative, and then number 2, you have to connect the dynamic data, meaning writing a few lines of JavaScript that say, hey, fit this headline into this particular div with text, or take this click-through URL, that's the dynamic data, and make that the click-through URL into creative. Then you test locally, then you upload to Studio. Basically, the setup code is that yellow highlighted code. I'm not going to get into this too deeply at the moment. Later on, we might look at this in more detail in Google Web Designer. But again, it's a 2-part process. Number 1, paste the setup code, and then number 2, connect the dynamic data. And you can see from this slide, it really is, for text and for click-through URLs, a few lines of JavaScript. Ditto for dynamic images. You might want to add a few more lines that sort of control how the image is positioned within the div and so forth. But it's fairly straightforward JavaScript. Now, after you've done your creative and you upload it in Studio, just like you would a normal Studio creative, you come back to the dynamic workflow. You're in step 5, and this is where you preview the dynamic functionality. It's important to note that this is the best place to make sure your dynamic creative is actually working and pulling in the different versions of the dynamic data depending on what you've defined as the strategy. In this screenshot, for example, you can see that it shows we're in Los Angeles, California. I'll actually show you this in action, but basically it's a way of entering in the different triggers for dynamic and seeing the result. For example, you will see how the creative looks when it's served to a user in Los Angeles. I could then go and enter in, say, New York for the geographical location. It would add that same creative to this tear sheet, is what they're called, and you would see that right below the LA version. And then you get a URL you can send to your client. It's basically a real quick way of showing the client what the dynamic creative looks like, all the different iterations. After you've done that, you're in the last step. You publish, you push the content live, and you are ready to launch the campaign. Before I go into the actual dynamic workflow in Studio, any other thoughts on what I've just said?
No, I mean, we're almost ready to show the creative development portion.
So I'll actually go into Studio, and I've got a brand new profile here. I'll click into that, and what we're going to do is set up this dynamic profile and wire it up to the creative that Owen's previously done and go through this 7-step process. We're going to be working with this feed that I was showing you before. Again, it's a very simple feed, but because it's simple, hopefully it will make these concepts easy to understand.
Just as a side note, feel free to ask questions within the Hangout itself. We love to have the questions, and we try to get to as many as we can. One of the questions so far was, is there an added cost to running trafficking dynamic ads? And if you're running rich media, there's no additional cost to running advanced dynamic. It's just a little trickier in terms of the setting up of the profile and the various ways to support that. So that's why we're doing this Hangout, to teach you guys what you need to know to get going creating them on your own.
7 steps to dynamic happiness. Here we are in step 2, manage data. I'm going to import the feed. Again, this is this feed that we were just looking at. I click New Content. The source is going to be a Google Doc, Google Sheets.
That's the most common type of feed. However, you do have the ability on there to pull in a remote file. The tricky part about that is getting the data formatted correctly. You can use XML or CSV, and this is sometimes used for real-time data, such as weather or voting or some kind of content that's going to be updated throughout the day. And you can actually set it to pull in automatically, but you need to make sure that whatever is coming in from that remote data source is able to always be retransformed without errors, because you wouldn't want to set something up, have it not be transformed properly, throw errors, and then your live campaign begins to not show the right data. You want extra attention to make sure that it's perfect.
But by far the most common way is to work with the Google Sheet, as we're doing here. So I've specified Google Docs as the content source. It's found my feed. And now I'm going to tell it which sheet in the feed to import. Again, in this feed, I've got 2 tabs. One is called Offer, one is called CTA. I'll talk, in a moment, I'll talk more about why there's 2 tabs, why I put this into 2 different sheets. So here I am, I say, okay, I want the offer sheet. Click Start Import. After a few minutes, it imports, and we click Continue. Now we're on, we're on step 2, manage data. We're in this sort of sub workflow that I talked about earlier, where you, number 1, tell it where the feed is, which is what we just did, and number 2, we have to set up a few required columns and data types. Now, every feed needs a couple things. Number 1, it needs a column of unique IDs. Usually, those unique IDs are just numbers. Each row has a different number. Why? Well, it's for dynamic reporting, so that you can see which row, which content started performing better. So my column name is called ID. That's my unique ID. And the second thing every feed needs is a column of reporting labels. Again, that's what shows up in the dynamic reporting, so that when you're looking at the report, you can see, oh, CA, that's California. That row served, that row served so many impressions, got so many click-throughs, etc. And so my column is called title. So there, I've just done the two required things that you need for any feed in the dynamic workflow. A column of IDs and a column of titles.
And just to, this brings up a good point, is the reporting label. So digital marketers, are spending marketing dollars, and you want to really get the most out of whatever campaign you're trying to do. And that's why before you kind of jump into setting up the profile, setting up the feed, and all the tiny nuts and bolts of data types and whatnot, you really want to take a step back and think about the strategy and what are we trying to measure here? How are we going to realize this customer lifetime value by spending these marketing dollars and things like that. And this, by doing that, then you already know before coming to the feed that, oh, I want to track the reporting label based on this. I want to see that. I expect to see X, Y, Z, and then this profile kind of just comes to meet that. And yeah, so it's taking a step back and figuring out the strategy before jumping into all of this.
What are you trying to accomplish, and how are you going to measure it? So going back to the feed, let me talk about targeting and why I have two different feeds here. I've got the CTA text, and for the CTA text, I'm just using what's called optimization. I'm testing. I want to see which of these texts performs best. Now, in contrast, this offer sheet, I've got it targeted to different users in different geolocations. And when you're targeting, a best practice is to always provide a default row, meaning if the user isn't in any of these, doesn't meet any of this targeting criteria, in this case, they don't live in California or they don't live in New York, what are they going to see? Well, we've got this thing called the default column. It's right here, and it's true, and that means that what we're saying is if the user isn't in any of those two areas, they'll see the content in this row, which is basically hello there. Not hello California, not hello New York, but just hello there. What we need to do when import the feeds, tell the studio what is the column containing these default values, these Boolean values. So I'm here, I say choose the column name called isDefault. And that's it. I've done the two required columns, ID and reporting label. I've also told it what default column, what is the default column. And now we're down here where we need to set data types. If you're a developer, you're probably familiar with data types like numbers, text, Booleans. Here in Studio, we've got a few additional data types, things like, well, geographical location. I've got that column of geolocations. I need to tell Studio, hey, this is a data type called accurate geotype. Everything else looks to be correct. Studio is generally pretty good about figuring out what data type a column should be. For example, it's got text for the other ones. It sees this column of click-throughs. It knows, okay, that's data type with exit URL. But it's good to double-check. So everything looks good here, and I'm going to click the Transform button. This basically sets up your dynamic element on the back end. And you'll see that now we're back here, Step 2 Manage Data. We've got that element that we just brought into Studio, and it's ready to go.
Just a side note about geolocation. So it doesn't actually explicitly request your device's IP address, like when you sometimes go to a website and it asks, allow the browser to use your location. What it's doing behind the scenes is, the viewer of the ad is on a certain IP address, which is a location on the internet, and it's just determining the geolocation from a range of IP addresses. So if it's a cellular device, it could be on AT&T's network with a number of other devices sharing that same, same location. So it's an approximation. It's not always perfect,
but it's perfect about 99% of the time.
Right, but there's going to be a spread where it's not going to know your exact geolocation at 182 latitude, longitude. It's doing its best guess, so you kind of have to just be prepared with your default content as best you can, and then that advanced layer of getting the pinpointed geographic message.
So I've imported one of those sheets. That's the offer sheet. I now need to import the other sheet called the CTA. Again, I click New Content. Again, I tell it, hey, it's a Google Doc, it's a Google Sheets. I select it, and this time I'll select the other sheet, which is named CTA. Start import. Yeah, everything looks fine. And here we are again. We need to tell it those two required columns, column for unique IDs, column for reporting labels. Come down here, take a quick look at the data types. They look fine. Also, recall that with the CTA feed, we're not using targeting. We're just serving these different CTA texts to every user, and over time, it's going to find out which ones perform better, start serving those more. Because we're not using targeting, we don't need to worry about a default column or default row. That's why I'm not going to bother with anything here for default column. Click Transform, and in a minute or less, we are back here, and now we've imported both sheets of the feed, and we're ready to move on to the next step. Step 3, Manage Rules. Save and continue. Here, as I mentioned earlier, is where you, at a high level, verify to Studio what dynamic strategy you're using for each feed, for each sheet in the feed. Recall that for CTAs, we're not using targeting. We're just using open optimization. And that's what we've got here. Now, however, for the offer sheet, we are targeting. We're targeting by geolocation. And that's why it says here, filtering on location. If you click this Manage button, you can see some of the details. Well, there's not very much to see here. It's basically just saying, yes, we are filtering by the user's geographical location. If for some reason you wanted to, midway during the campaign, you could turn that off. But we'll leave it on, and we'll continue on to the next step, which is generate code. Now here is where it spits out, as I mentioned earlier, kind of a representation of your dynamic data. If I'm on and I'm building my creative, what I do is I copy all of this code and paste it into my creative in GWD.
Yeah, I usually just go to this, select all, and paste it just before the closing body tag, and that ensures that it's not going to slow anything down. It's at the end of the HTML page, and it's all there. It's formatted correctly. The only thing maybe to point out is it creates an object that says dev dynamic content, and you can see there's a little quote or a little comment in there that says the way you use it, the object that's passed is called dynamic content, not dev dynamic content. So there's an example at the bottom of the invocation code that you can just copy to see its usage. So it's just dynamic content dot so whatever your feed is called, and then that's an array of your different columns in the feed.
Basically, just pay attention to that little footnote at the bottom of the code as to how you address the dynamic content in your JavaScript.
And again, this is just for local testing. This just sets up the object so that it's there. When you go to access it, it doesn't give you a JavaScript error saying this isn't there yet when it's local. And you can begin using it on enabler init. That's where you just map your presentation layer to your dynamic data layer.
So here we are at step 5, preview. And in this step is where you actually test your dynamic functionality. For example, in our feed, we have 3 different headlines and 3 different click-throughs. And we are targeting by geographical location. Because we're targeting by geolocation, Studio is smart enough to know that, okay, we're going to want to enter in a geographical location here to test it. So, if all goes well, I copy in this value from the feed. Just as a footnote here, for geolocation, it's important to use a certain syntax in that geo column in the feed. And when you test, same thing. So it's kind of the best practice, just to make sure you're not doing any typos or anything, get the geolocation wrong, copy and paste from the feed. So I've copied that value for California. If all goes well, when I click Launch Update Preview, the headline should be appropriate for California. It says, Hello California, and when I click through, it should go to whatever I have set up here. Now, because Voro is an imaginary car company, we don't have a different site at Voro, California, Voro, New York. So I just put in a generic URL for California, and if I click through on that, voila, it goes to the California page. Now, what happens if instead I enter in New York? And despite my warning you to always copy and paste from the feed, I'm just going to live dangerously and type in New York, click Launch Update Preview, and the headline should be the New York headline. It says Hello New York. When I click on the ad and I click through, it goes to New York. So that all seems to be functioning as intended. Now finally, what if I'm in some other location? What if I'm in Arizona in the United States and I click Launch Update Preview? What will happen? Well, what should happen is that since I'm not in either of these 2 targeted locations, it will serve the default row. It should just say hello there, and I click through, it should go to google.com. Click Launch Update Preview. It says hello there, and when I click through, it goes to Google. Now, one last thing about these tear sheet previews. It's a really good way of showing your client that, hey, the dynamic functionality is working as intended. For example, well, I meant to show you the URL that you share. I very cleverly closed the window before I did that. But basically, if you click the Share button, and you can specify the privacy settings, and voila, it gives you a URL that you copy and paste, send in an email to the client. And when they open up that URL, they'll see the exact same thing you're seeing. And it's a fully functioning creative that they're looking at. They can click through, etc. Finally, let's see, I wanted to talk about one more thing. What happens if you, instead of targeting, you are just using open optimization, as we're doing here? Which CTA will you see in the creative? Well, because it's open optimization, the back end over time starts serving the best performing row to users. But at the moment, the back end, of course, has no idea what's the best performing row. So basically what you'll see is just a random row here. Sometimes the CTA will say buy now, other times it will say buy today, etc. And then once you're satisfied everything looks good, click Save and Continue. You're at this next step, which is basically means back to dynamic reporting. Every sheet in the feed will, in your dynamic reports, will show at least this reporting label. Sometimes you might want to add another reporting label with additional details. I don't know, foo and fum and so forth. And if this column had a name, and if we had imported it, here I could select additional columns to show in the dynamic report. Finally, click Save and Continue, and you're at the last step, which is you publish the profile. Now, just a word of, it's not really a word of caution, more of a best practice is to hold off on publishing the profile until you've done some of the initial dynamic preview, make sure it's working correctly. Maybe you'd even send some URLs to your client so that they can see it's functioning correctly. The reason you want to hold off in publishing is because once you publish it, it's much harder to change things. It's much harder to change a few specific things. For example, data types. If I come back in here and I decide, oh, you know what, that column in the feed for geolocations, I really don't want that to be geolocations. I want that to be text or whatever. Well, if you're in the draft mode of the profile, which you can see you are because it says draft up here, it's easy to come in and change this data type. However, watch what happens when I publish it. I'll come back here to the last step in the process, and I'll click Publish. While we're waiting for it to publish, I'll also just mention that once the profile is published, it only takes a very brief period of time, under half an hour, for those changes to go live. Now, getting back to what I was talking about with how you can how it's a little more difficult to change things at this point. If I come back in here into the element, you can see the data types are grayed out. So what happens if I do want to change one of those data types? Well, I create a draft version of the profile and make my changes, test and preview, and when you're in preview, you can even go back and forth between the draft and publish tabs. So you can see what the current version of the creative looks like that's live, that's published, or what the creative looks like in this draft version where you're making changes. Once you're satisfied everything is working, publish the draft version. That becomes the new published profile.
Yeah, I mean, it gets a little tricky sometimes when you want to add a field after you've already published, or even when you're in a draft stage. Sometimes you have to delete the content and re-add it. Sometimes it's as easy as just retransforming.
Yeah, you know, I'm sorry to interrupt, but let me quickly show you transforming in action, because that's by far the most common change to make in a feed, and that's also the easiest to do. So let's say, for example, I want to change Hello California to, oh, I don't know, Hello LA, and I make that change in the feed. I come back to the profile. Here to step 2, manage data, and I'm hello. Here we are. I come over here, and yeah, thank you.
This is real time seeing all the tricky idiosyncrasies.
And this goes back to what I just mentioned. Once the profile is published, you can't edit it. So if you want to make any changes, even if it's just as simple as changing a value in the feed, you have to create a draft version of the profile.
And that's done by design, because when things are about to go live and the campaign's about to launch, you don't want too many hands in the cookie jar and people making all changes. You want to have everything perfect when you publish, when you go from the draft state to the published state.
So now I've created a draft version of the profile. I click Retransform, and I click Save. Now, when I go to Dynamic Preview, if I enter in that first row in the feed, that geolocation, don't always trust my typing skills, that's why I'm copying and pasting. And now when I click Launch Update Preview, it should show that new headline, which says Hello LA. And then when I'm ready, I would click Publish. It would publish this draft version of the profile, and within 30 minutes, those changes are propagated live. And The big takeaway here is without any retrafficking of the creative. We haven't touched the creative at all during this process.
That's amazing.
Absolutely amazing. So dynamic allows you to quickly make changes in the dynamic content and push them live without retrafficking the creative in a very simple manner. Now, I interrupted you before to show you how easy retransforming the feed is. If you want to do anything, any so-called structural change to the feed, like say you want to add additional columns like I'm doing here, that's a little trickier because in your draft version of the profile, you'd want to come back and remove that feed, the CTA feed in this example, and then re-import it and go through the process again of setting data types.
So one of the questions in the questions is that how do you deal with different size images when you're doing dynamic creative? Sometimes you have a 728 by 90. Sometimes you have a 300 by 250. There's different form factors that are all being driven from the same creative profile. And the answer to that is we've seen a lot of clients do is add a column, a field in the feed that has a specific size or pixel resolution image, and then by giving these different an array of different size images to the creative itself, you can then manage which image you want to show on the client with JavaScript. So you can just deal with your responsive stuff in your media query if statement to just pick out the image you want to show, and because you have all of them listed there, and that allows you to kind of manage that presentation layer logic on the client level, but you still have what you need driven by the creative dynamically.
On the theory that one picture is worth 1,000 words, if we could switch to showing the feed that I've got up here, I've just added a couple of additional columns. One is for 300 by 250 images, another is for 728 by 90 images. And in the creative, you would add code that says, hey, if I'm a 300 by 250, get this value from the dynamic data. There's also another way to do it called creative dimension filtering that I won't go into now, but basically that would allow you to have just one column of images, but then each row is a different ad size. One is for the 300 by 250, another is for the 728 by 90. So basically it auto-magically picks the right size image to serve. One final note, if you can see here, you can use images in asset library. That's actually the best practice for where you store your dynamic images, and there's a certain syntax you have to use when filling out the feed. This begins with DRM asset or something like that.
And so you might be wondering what is asset library. Asset library is a feature within DoubleClick Studio that it's one of the top primary navigation items, and it gives the ability to kind of share assets across campaigns, across creatives, and it gets really powerful when you combine it with dynamic. Whenever you create a new creative in Studio, it creates a folder that you can then switch to the Asset Library tab and look at. Then you can also, so every file you put into that creative is automatically put into Asset Library. Then you can also create custom folders and manage. It's a whole directory structure, like a kind of like a client delivery network or some kind of managed storage, and so every asset becomes an entity in Asset Library. Every file that you upload, you can upload things directly into this to that other UI, and then once an asset's there, for instance, a video, it'll create different versions of the file, and then when you have that asset selected in Asset Library, that's where on the right-hand side in the details you can select and copy the Asset Library ID, and that value is what you then put into the feed that Kevin was just showing. And that's how you can, kind of using that Asset Library ID in a feed, dynamically swap out and share that across any creative in your advertiser.
Basically, your assets like images or videos, they can live in one central place, which is asset library. They can be shared among campaigns, and they can be referenced in dynamic feeds. And it's not just images or videos. You can also do the same thing with JavaScript files, CSS files, etc.
Yeah, video files especially is really cool because it creates different video files, like for different connection speeds. So it kind of just automatically creates the right video file, the size, quality. If you're on a phone, you don't need a giant HD version of the video to try to stream onto that device when you're only looking at it this big. So asset library and DoubleClick engineering kind of handle that behind the scenes for you.
At runtime, the backend automatically selects the appropriate video file and format for the user. Do you think we should move into Q&A now?
Yeah, so we have about 9 minutes left. Maybe we can just blast through the demo, or we have a couple of questions here.
Sure. For example, what is quantity in the profile? I'm actually off the screen right now, and what that is for is that most of the times this will be 1, because you really only want to pick 1 row from each sheet. There are a few use cases where you maybe want to serve multiple rows from a sheet to a user. The most common use case is products. Supposing I had a sheet of products here, and I had, in my creative, I had a product carousel. I would say the product carousel showed 3 different products. Here in Studio, I changed this to 3, and that means at runtime, the backend will pick not just 1 row from a products feed, but 3 rows, and they'll come in as part of the dynamic data. And without getting too much into the details, I'll just say that in the creative code, if you look carefully, you'll see it's an array: product 0, product 1, product 2.
Cool. Next question is, where can I see a report to see which row is performing best? So CTA text. How do you tell which version of the ad is doing the best? Well, that comes in under the trafficking section of DoubleClick. So that's the reporting attribution phase, and that's how you can kind of pull all of the different metrics that you're curious about that you want to see.
Basically, you go into DCM and use Report Builder just like you normally would. We have a Help Center page specifically dedicated to dynamic reports, how you work with those in Report Builder.
So using Edge Animate to create a dynamic unit. So Edge Animate, at least in my experience, is a little tricky when you try to start mapping your presentation layer to your data. It kind of takes the presentation layer and does this whole export routine.
Yeah, it's a proprietary format. You look at the HTML, and it's
yeah, it's got all that automatically generated stuff. So we don't actually support the going into Edge Animate beforehand. You could theoretically open up the publish file and expand it, like unminify it, and then manually figure out what variables are what at that point.
That also adds a lot to file size.
Right. So use with caution.
Another question is, can we use AdWords feeds?
So this is all DoubleClick. There is a way to create and upload dynamic units into AdWords, but that's not covered in this video, and that is coming soon for public availability. And yeah, that's something that's being built in, and we'll get it to you as soon as we can.
So to summarize, AdWords feeds are templated for specific verticals. DoubleClick Rich Media Dynamic is really more about making your own feed. So they're kind of 2 separate things. Right. That having been said, a quick plug for Google Web Designer, it's just starting to be able to work with AdWords dynamic remarketing. So if you don't like some of the template feeds or designs, excuse me, if you don't like some of the template creatives in AdWords, you'll soon be able to use Google Web Designer to build your own template that hooks right into the AdWords feeds.
Cool. So we have about 5 minutes left. A couple more questions is how do you address file size requirements with a dynamic ad?
That's a good question.
It's rich media. So is that polite loading? So you can, in enabler init, after the page is loaded, after the ad is ready to be shown, that's where you can use the enabler get URL to use the dynamic data and load in any assets that you need after the page is loaded. So that's a polite load, and what is the requirements for rich media now is about 2.5 megs an initial load, and then up to
HTML5 file size is a sort of a work in progress. The IAB is working on a spec for that. But I think the second part of this question really maybe sort of pinpoints what's being asked. Do you have to test each possible dynamic result? I would only test outlier cases. For example, maybe you have a column of dynamic images. Most of them are about the same file size. Supposing you have one that's really, really large. Well, you might want to you might want to check the worst case, which is that a really large image, and see where that adds up to in file size, and see if you're still under publisher spec for file size. So to summarize that answer, most of the times you don't need to test each dynamic possibility. Just look at the outliers, the worst case scenarios. And again, it's mainly with images or video. Things like text, it's usually no problem.
Another question on here is, can you target elements in the ad based on location with unique CSS? Example, if the text for New York text caused a line wrap where Ohio did not, you wanted to specifically control for the New York case, is that possible? So there's a couple of different ways to do that. One is putting HTML into the feed cell.
HTML markup?
Right, like a break tag. You can also do it with JavaScript, where you can check to see the size of your HTML element, the width, if it was made bigger after setting the content, and then handling, like, using if statement to, if it's bigger than this width, then expand the height and readjust the other elements. So it's getting to that level of manipulation in your code that you can kind of handle and expect these edge cases and handle them gracefully. It's up to the creative developer.
But the most common way is, as Owen mentioned at first, just add some HTML markup into your feed. You'd have one row for Ohio, another row for New York, and just add in the appropriate line breaks in the headline or whatever it is that's specific to Ohio and specific to New York.
Okay, we're running out of time here. Can people not logged into DoubleClick Studio manipulate the preview? So the only thing you can do when you're not logged in or on the account is view the external preview that's able to be shown to anyone. It's a publicly facing URL. Anything else, like where you set specific values to see a specific row in the feed, that is handled by whoever has permissions to view that in the profile. And so if you're expecting to see some, and you don't have access, I would communicate with someone that does have access, have them create another tear sheet, and then you can view the use cases that are appropriate.
And actually, within the tear sheet, you are able to enter in, say, different geographical location. So you sent the tear sheet to your client or to someone else. That is a possible way of them manipulating the values, the dynamic values that the creative uses, and seeing the results.
Okay, well, great. Thanks everyone for joining today. It was really fun and exciting to go on that journey with us.
Dare I
learning about-
say it was even dynamic?
It was a dynamic journey through dynamic rich media on the DoubleClick digital marketing platform. Stay tuned for upcoming Hangouts on Air. Next week we got a really another really great one using deep dive into Google Web Designer. And stay tuned, and thanks for watching.
Thank you. Happy dynamicizing.